Good morning.
Good morning.
This is episode 75 in the year of our Lord 2020, August the 6th,
Yes.
the day that shall go
And
down forever in infamy.
I guess the sunlight is breaking over the horizon. That was
Mhm.
very dramatic. I didn't
Yeah,
really
I'm just
get
like,
that.
how do I keep, I need to spice up our teaser, Gotta
A
spice it up.
quarter of a century worth of, 3/4 of a century worth of episodes.
I know. This is like, people should be lucky if they live to be 75. If we make it to
Exactly.
next week, we will have surpassed it.
Yes, absolutely. So I'm Daniel Wolford. I direct the Minnesota Institute of Contemplation and Healing.
I'm Mark Van Steenwyk. I direct the Center for Prophetic Imagination. And we have a starting request. We're talking about fear. And this is from CK. CK and I are both nerds, Dune nerds. We joke about this all the time.
Hey,
So
Dune.
he wants me to start with the litany of fear. And since this is almost like church for some of us, maybe I will start with this litany. It's from the book and the movie Dune. I must not fear. Fear is the mind killer. Fear is the little death that brings total obliteration. I will face my fear. I will permit it to pass over me and through me. And when it has gone past, I will turn the inner eye to see its path. Where the fear has gone, there will be nothing. Only I will remain. This, the word of Frank Herbert.
Yes.
Praise be to God.
Yeah. Now another great thing. Dune is great. Another great thing related to this issue of fear, which would very much align with that quote. If you have not seen the movie Defending Your Life, I would highly recommend it. It came out around the time when Shirley MacLaine and reincarnation and this whole thing of we only use 10% of our brain was really popular, and so it's all about what happens after you die, and you go to this purgatory where you have to deal with your fears, and you're determined whether you get reincarnated back on Earth or go on to the next life, and it's absolutely hilarious. But it deals with this whole issue of fear as well. And so we decided to address this because there's a fun article in Sojourners recently talking about the interesting difference between people who want to use guns acquire guns for their protection, but don't like the idea of wearing masks for their protection.
Yeah, it's a comparison a lot of people have made, and I feel like it's worth going deeper into because it's like, I don't know if it's kind of a gotcha thing, and I'm like, well, it's not just a gotcha. We need to talk about why those fears are different and where the irrationality is and where it makes sense. Like, because there's something powerful about having a gun. Like, we need to acknowledge what that does for someone. So like, this is worth digging into. And also, again, as we tend to do, it's not as though people who are gun averse are free from irrational fears. So like, we need to understand what makes us tick so that we can live full lives.
Right. So I do think that's what you just mentioned as one good starting point and angle to it, which is obviously that a gun kind of imbues oneself with more power and sense of power than a mask. A mask is pretty wimpy, doesn't really feel very powerful. So if we're talking, and even the act of putting on this mask, putting on protective gear. Right. So we could also look at this, take this out of the pandemic world and just like even look at protective gear. So, I mean, having worked construction for years and years, there were a lot of guys that I worked with that every time there was a new type of protective gear or harness or, OSHA regulation, they'd be pissed off. right? And they're just like,
Yeah.
I don't want to wear that. That thing's dumb. These wimps and other kinds of even more derogatory words, which you can imagine.
It's like the way
Yeah,
fishermen in Minnesota, if they see a boat go by with people wearing their life jackets, it's like,
right.
pansies. Yeah.
Yeah, life jackets, seat belts. I mean, all these kinds of things that there is this sense that that kind of protection, feels inadequate somehow, or even creates a feeling in one of inadequacy. Whereas a gun creates a feeling of power.
Yeah. And just like the things that the mask protects you from, it's like it's invisible, so it's already abstract. But like, I can relate to the feeling of thinking a mask is like, I'm the kind of guy who, if someone says 5-second rule, I'm like, more like 15-second rule. Like, I'm the kind of guy who doesn't wear gloves when you're using like a chemical product where it tells you have to use gloves. Like, I get that instinct of like, this is just overly worried about some theoretical safety. I'm tough enough. Like, I have that instinct too. Right. And so if you have that instinct and you don't understand the science or willfully refuse to believe the science, I get why you think wearing a mask is an impotent act of propriety rather than an actually helpful act. I understand that. Of course, I know better. And I also get like mask is about protecting. And even though we say guns are about protecting, really deep down inside, it's about like, I have the ability to kill some motherfuckers. I get to go on the offenses if I need to. And that makes me feel powerful.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. And I also think that there is a certain issue around what do I want to say? If we wear some of these protective things, but right, this threat is invisible, and we're sort of admitting our powerlessness, then it actually increases fear.
Yes.
It actually increases fear, which is sort of an interesting thing. So in a way, that attitude that you described, the 15-second rule, the not wearing gloves, blah blah blah, it actually brings us more face to face with our fear. Whereas not doing those things and rejecting them is a way of kind of pushing away our fears.
Yeah.
It's saying, I don't have to worry about this.
Yeah.
Whereas sort of arming ourselves or doing these, offensive capabilities, they decrease our fear out of feeling powerful. So in a way, those responses, which seem inconsistent, are in some ways actually consistent, right? We're trying to do things to avoid or minimize fear.
Now, the irony is usually the gun culture stuff works from a place of denial, right? Same with the mask avoidance stuff. So like, I'll use an example of a family gathering I went to on one Thanksgiving. The relative had swords hanging over the wall as a form of art. Like, so it's just hyper masculinist, but it's a female relative. Right. So that kind of was like a little bit jarring at first, but then she went into how one day, she has a sword, a full functional sword sandwiched between her countertop and the oven. Like there's that little gap there. Just a sword there in case somebody comes into the kitchen, right? So she's telling me about
seriously,
yeah. And she told me one day she woke up in the middle of the night and her boyfriend was gone, and she heard a sound. So she reached for the gun that's loaded and ready underneath the edge of her bed. So this is ready there. Went out and saw this man in her living room, and she pulled the gun out and she was like, "What were you doing here?" Ready to blow his head off. And she realized, oh wait, this guy looks familiar. Oh, it's the guy who lives 3 doors down who's got Alzheimer's. So she's like, oh, I'll get him home. And like as she's telling the story, she's laughing, and her boyfriend is like, good thing I wasn't here. That motherfucker would be dead. Like, and they're all joking. And then they're all posturing this as though how they're badass and they're not afraid. I'm like, literally everything I've experienced so far with you has told me how terrified you are all the time.
Right.
And that's the irony. Like, to me, it's like this gun. You don't stockpile guns unless you're afraid.
Right. Now I should just make a caveat here that we're not talking about guns in terms of, hunting, right? That's about the whole gun thing is that, having lived in rural areas now half my life, I'm very comfortable with the whole hunting phenomenon, and I don't have any problem at all with that. And so that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about these folks that show up at these rallies, now dripping with AK-47s and rocket launchers and all this stuff. And and people who are intentionally talking about buying their guns for protection. Right. So that's what we're getting at here.
It's probably also worth caveating a little bit with there's leftist gun culture and right-wing gun culture, and there's a Venn diagram of overlap. Like, personally, I'm not into leftist gun culture. I think it can be machismo too, and I also think like you're not going to be able to succeed against a white supremacist government. But at the same time, I recognize that Black Panther gun ownership was more rational than what we have in like dudes in militias, white dudes in militias.
Yes.
It's a more rational response.
Yeah, and there's that whole world of Black gun ownership for protection. I mentioned that book, This Nonviolent Stuff Will Get You Killed. So that's also a whole other thing. Now, what we're sort of zeroing in on, and what this article is zeroing in on, is this very particular phenomenon of white gun culture for the purpose, supposedly, of protection and defending oneself from government intrusion, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the Venn diagram of those folks and the people that don't want to wear masks has massive overlap.
Just to throw in another wrench, like, so to me, it's easy to see the people wearing the guns, but to me, a scared liberal person who's too quick to call the police is also on that Venn diagram. Just because you outsource, this is part of what neoliberal culture does. We outsource our violence. I don't give a crap if you pull a trigger or you have a policeman come and pull the trigger on your behalf. You're just as culpable in my mind. And so this reaching towards violence, using weaponry of violence of some sort to protect ourselves over against an imaginary other, that's pervasive. I mean, this is how we got here. These people these Karens and Chads that call the police on Black people aren't right-wingers usually. This is a pervasive problem that we have to look inside ourselves.
Yeah. And so to me, a big part of this, because this really is in many ways a very uniquely American phenomenon, right? So to me, a big part of this, I think, is connected very much to the terrorism of whiteness that our society was founded on, that there is this deep-seated sense. I mean, sure, fear is a ubiquitous human phenomenon, but then particular cultures have particular fears and particular levels of paranoia that they engage in. And, when one has based one's society on the murder of millions of people, there is a sense of, I kind of need to be perpetually afraid, because what if those people try to do to me what I did to them? And the level of, weaponry in this society is unparalleled anywhere else in the world. And so too is that level of fear. Right? And so that instead of cultivating a sense of peace and facing fear, we continue to cultivate more and more fear, which of course is a big part of what's going on with the whole Trump world phenomenon. Is it's just all about fear and heightening people's fears.
Some comments just to dig into. CK writes, having a gun has the power to kill. A mask has the power to save lives. Yeah, I mean, it's a very different impulse, and it's interesting to me how much being a gun toter does not create a sense of neighborliness to me. But having a mask does. Like, there's fear. Like, when I wear a mask, like, here's a comment from Patricia: if I wear a mask, I have to face fear and grief. That's true. And also,
Hmm.
I've never been more thoughtful about my neighbors as I have during this time. So it's interesting. A fear that causes you to come together against a real foe versus a fear where even your neighbors are suspect. It's like,
Hmm.
it's a different kind of fear. Kathleen writes, I had a parishioner who decorated his Christmas tree with tiny, tiny gun ornaments. I'm going to have to Amazon that later to see. Nothing else, just guns. Freaked me out.
Well, Kathleen, you've been coming up with some great things. Did this person have a tuna can full of with a candle in it underneath the Christmas tree?
He's
Yeah, that's awesome.
that's been in this
Yeah, well,
period.
and look, this there is this theological piece to this, right? Very much so, because a lot of the theology that is espoused in communities that have this similar overlapping Venn diagram is that Jesus is going to come back to be extremely violent, and that the second coming is a violent coming of God.
Mm-hmm.
And it's really interesting, over the years, I've talked to these folks. And I said, well, in the Bible, like, Jesus is nonviolent. This is very clear. He says all these things. And I've had people say things to me like, well, that was the first time he came. But the second time he comes, he's going to be violent.
That reminds me of one of the great American films, UHF, starring Weird Al Yankovic. And he takes this crappy UHF station, which for people from the before times, like way when this used to have like the main channels, and then there'd be these weird ass UHF channels, which
Right.
don't
The
exist.
special channels.
Special channels. It's like community access almost. But then he had to come up with a bunch of programming, and one of them is Gandhi 2. This time he means payback. And so they had this whole trailer, brilliant trailer for a Gandhi Part 2 movie
Gandhi too,
where
right?
he's like, uh, just a guy in a diaper running around shooting people with machine guns. Like, that's kind of what you'd imagine.
Ninja Gandhi.
Yeah, Ninja Gandhi. ZK writes, fear has been an American experiment for the past 100 years. Well, maybe
Wow,
before that. It's
maybe
definitely,
even before that. Yeah.
it's part of the fiber of our social DNA. Yeah. Catherine writes, what role do you think movies and narratives play in these fears versus actual experience of harm? In my experience, I've always been most afraid of white guys I know with guns because domestic violence is the top non-natural way I'm likely to die. But violent deaths by gun-toting strangers are way overrepresented in movies. I mean, it's
Yeah,
it's totally a thing.
absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, and it's movies, narratives, news shows, right? I mean, what is one of the most prominent ways that black men are portrayed in these things is they're these violent crazy people who are out to get you. um, and Catherine, what you bring up is another sort of great example of all of this bizarre twisted thing around fear. Right, is that domestic violence is one of the biggest real things that that we need to be looking at, and that women are afraid of, and yet that form of violence, when you try to address it, just like wearing masks, you get all these people that want to pretend it doesn't exist. They don't want to really deal with it. Police just sort of laugh it off.
Mhm.
Our systems don't really want to spend money on it. So again, it's this very misplaced, neurotic, some might say psychotic relationship with both reality and what it is that we really should be afraid of.
Mhm. Yeah, and everything is disproportionate in how media is represented. Like, we know from studies that children aren't necessarily more at risk to stranger violence than before, but it's something that people, when I was growing up, did not care about because I grew up before Jacob Wetterling, and then after Jacob Wetterling, now that stuff gets amplified. Now, I want to know about that stuff, but at the same time, it instills fear. Or what Dan was talking about with the second coming of Jesus, like this very uniquely modern, very uniquely American monomyth, the myth of redemptive violence, that you can fix things through violence, but in the very American way, where the individual hero comes from outside the community and cleanses the community of its evildoers. It's the cowboy myth that you see in films all the time. Like,
yeah, no, that's a very classic American trope.
And so this is, and you're a boy in particular, growing up with this. You valorize these men who are coming in with weapons who can cleanse the community of harm, and then you hear in the news that the harm is like these black communities where there are drugs and children without fathers. Like, so this is part of the indoctrination of American males. And so then they think, I need to protect my family and my loved ones against these harms, against drug dealers and cartels. It is so irrational.
Yeah.
I keep thinking, this is Gus, I keep thinking of the way John Howard Yoder uses Pascal's wager grid around gun use, not use, and effective not. In the use and not effective slot, he points out there's another two outcomes, one being escalated tragedy. That's the piece that, when you're a gun toter, you don't want to talk about. The idea that somehow you could make things worse by introducing another violent weapon into the mix, which is statistically way more likely than you like putting down the bad guy before harm happens.
Yeah, and there's another grid of this. So we've got the gun mask use thing, perceived violence, domestic violence grid. The other interesting grid of this irrational fear is the safety of different countries. All right, so one of the things when you start to think about doing international travel, which we've successfully eliminated because of the pandemic, but in the before time when you could think about international travel, you immediately hear all these things. Oh, these other countries are so dangerous. There's this thing, there's that thing. I mean, when we were traveling around the world, we started to get these alerts that one of the places we were going to had this armed uprising, and it was this super dangerous place to go to. My experience, having traveled around the world in many, many different countries, is that there is no more country that is dangerous. There's no country that's more dangerous than the United States. And it's actually because of not only how many guns we have in this country that do not exist in other countries, but also because of the level of aggression in our society. I mean, the level of aggression, and you can just feel it walking down the street, and it mostly is coming off of white men. The level of aggression in our society is off the charts. And you go to other countries and you just do not feel that. Right? You don't feel that. And I have been in all kinds of places in other parts of the world that I have never felt unsafe in the slightest. And there are plenty of places in America that I've been wanting to pay a great deal of attention to my surroundings. And and that place that was supposedly having that great armed insurrection, we went there, and it was this lovely little tropical island, and there was nothing going on there. So.
It's funny, we hear about, like, the Middle East is a classic example. I knew a guy who was a missionary in the Middle East. He was in Beirut, and you hear Beirut, and you're a certain age as an American, you think, oh, violence. Because all you heard about was Beirut is this hot spot of violence. And he's like, I would put my 9-year-old child on the bus by themselves to go across town because it's so safe there. I would never allow that to happen in the American city. And I'm like, and at the time I'm like, what? America's fine. but I've quickly learned that's false. Like, except for war-torn areas, the United States is the most dangerous place to be because of the things Dan mentioned, and we just don't see it because we're used to it. And then we hear elevated stories from far away. Julia writes, Julia's got great. It's like a battle for the most amazing stories right now. Julia writes, I accidentally infiltrated a racist neo-Nazi group in rural northern Minnesota when I was homeschooling my kids. Their kids
I love this.
said that there was magazines.
What did you do today? Oh, I accidentally infiltrated a radical Nazi group. Oops, here I am in the middle of a radical Nazi group.
Yeah, their kids said there was magazines in the false floor of their barn. I thought, what a strange place to keep reading material. For those who are not clued into the word what magazine means, it can also mean ammo. But it's funny, like my wife's church, I remember when I found out, rural Minnesota, that the bulk of the men in that church were part of a militia. And I'm like, oh. Right. And then I found out this is not that uncommon in rural places. Minnesota's not as bad as like Montana. But these sorts
some parts of it are,
yeah, some parts of it are, and it's not not abnormal. I have to tell people all the time, like I have to remind myself that I'm the extremist. That people that are malicious are more mainstream than me.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Which is weird.
So Siri's here is wondering about how do you, right. So
the book of Revelation is all about like helicopters with lion faces on it, sent by God to destroy people.
Yeah. So you start with the book of Revelation, you throw in a little bit of Daniel, and you take a real violent spin on the apocalyptic literature of the Bible. And so Jesus is going to surf down out of the clouds, on a dragon with a giant machine gun. And that's how you get it.
Yeah. That's exclusively how I heard the book of Revelation interpreted, as divine retribution and the final clearing away of debts. And so Satan and all of his fallen angels, and then all those who followed the Antichrist, are all thrown into the lake of fire for all eternity.
Right, the big lake of fire. Yep.
Yeah. Gus says he has it somewhere. He'll try to post a picture of it. That'd be helpful.
Yeah.
Julie says, my son Isaac said, Mama, these people interpret the Bible very strangely, like hateful to Jews and black and Indian people. I quickly got a clue.
Right. Yeah.
I'm sorry that you had to stumble into that. And that stuff is way more like, if you're kind of a liberal-ish person who just has always grown up in liberal-ish areas, two things that I think are important to point out. What Julie is describing is not abnormal.
No, it's not unusual.
It's common, but at the same time, not every person in rural white America is a right-wing racist. Right. So I want to say this is not abnormal, but white rural poor people aren't just your stereotype either. So just want to point both of those things out. Heather writes, the cowboy movies got resurrected during the Vietnam War.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I mean, they get resurrected. And that same plot got turned into all kinds of war movies, right? So they're, and maybe that's what you're referring to, Heather. But yeah, I mean, the cowboy film has been morphed into every possible modern scenario, war movie. Yeah.
Now that you say that, I'm realizing, okay, Unforgiven and Young Guns came out during the Gulf War. And then there has been a resurgence in the last decade or so. Okay, this is something to notice.
Well, and then what's very interesting about that is that when that same plot gets turned into a movie and gets flipped around, though, where the cowboy is a black guy, like Django, white people get very, very nervous. Yeah, very, very nervous.
Yeah, that's a good point, too. Ceres writes, also, I noticed that when someone actually uses self-defense against abusers and oppressors, many Second Amendment folks condemn victims who had to resort to self-defense and stand your ground.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There's many women who are in jail for having killed their abusers. And one of the things I point out all the time is that the only effective gun control lobby in the history of modern America have been the Black Panthers, who, because they decided to follow cops around Oakland in huge Cadillac convertibles, carrying their guns, perfectly legal. Suddenly, Ronald Reagan became, who was the governor at the time in California, became a big fan of gun control. And so, Black people with guns have been the only way that we've been able to get any kind of gun control laws enacted. Yeah, I mean, suddenly these folks, when they're really looking at people who are truly being oppressed and having violence used against them, when they want to use guns, that doesn't make people happy.
So I'm noticing you cut out for a second, Dan, so I don't know if you were still talking, but we're past time.
I'm done.
Okay.
Just about. Yeah, we got a couple more comments.
A couple more comments, and then I think we're not going to be back on until Tuesday. Is that right, Dan?
Tuesday, yes.
Okay, so we'll take a long
got a 4-day weekend.
Yeah, we're Dan and I are going on an international flight to the Bahamas, so we'll be gone. We're with guns, and we're not wearing masks, and we're violating any sort of like border containment. Julia wrote, my twins passed for white. Boy, it got scary when menfolk found a unsure family was engaging with theirs.
Yeah, I bet.
Kathleen writes, do you think white male aggression is a result of the Who? Like, I'm wondering what that means.
You mean the rock band? I'm not sure.
I like the Who. What does it say about me? White culture teaches boys not to express feelings. That's true. Yeah. Oh, and Julia, unpure. Okay, that's what.
Not unsure family.
Sure. Unpure right, family. Unpure. Gotcha.
Yeah.
Yes. White culture. I'm from the upper Midwest, rural, so I don't know if that's the way it is everywhere, but I feel like I had forced stoicism. Anytime I would express any softness or emotionality at all, I was told to suck it up. And I find those words coming out of my mouth towards my son sometimes because I'm like, don't know how to handle his emotions. It just goes deep. It's kind of screwed up.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So, all right. Well, this is great. Another half hour gone. So go forth.
You will ever get back.
That's right. So go forth and do not be afraid.
Be not afraid.
Be not afraid.
See you Tuesday, everybody.
Bye.